What would you have seen in Rome in 476 AD? This is a question that I have tried to answer in the second video ever on this channel, but apparently this answer has not been precise enough, and therefore I decided to make a follow-up video, where I will attempt to shed more light on this quite difficult question as to what we would have seen in the city of Rome in that fateful year of 476 AD. So the reason why I decided that a second video was necessary is that, judging from the comments, apparently many people had misunderstood that video. This was the second video ever on this channel, but unfortunately I had to take it down due to a copyright issue and have re-uploaded it again in a slightly modified form, which you can find here, link in the description. Many people thought that the core essence of this video was to show how absolutely intact and amazing Rome must have looked in 476 AD, even despite having suffered 3 sacks in 410, 455 and 472 AD. But towards the end of the video I talked in more detail about the shabby state that many of the buildings of Rome must have been in, especially on the interior side. For instance, many of the beautiful ornaments and golden statues of the city had been certainly carried off by the Visigoths, by the Vandals and by Ricimer's barbarians in the 3 sacks, and the temples had long been closed since 395 AD. The interior of many buildings must have been in a quite ruinous state. However, from the outside, many of the buildings, especially in the Forum Romanum area and the ancient core of the city, must have still appeared quite intact and surprisingly well preserved. There is a lot of archaeological evidence that many buildings had been repaired even as late as under the rule of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, after the Western Roman Empire had ceased to be, and when it was already part of this new Germanic kingdom. Even during that time, archaeological evidence shows that all the major baths were in use and all the aqueducts were still functioning. There is also evidence that many buildings were kept in shape and repaired. For example, repairs were carried out in the Forum Romanum by the urban prefect of Rome of that time, Epiphanius, in 412 and 414 AD. This can be found on an inscription. But there are many more such inscriptions, proving that many repairs were performed. Another one was found at the Aventine Baths, where a collapsed wall of the baths was restored in 414 or 415 AD. Another was found near the Circus Flaminius, where the urban prefect, the Praefectus Urbi, Glabrio Faustus, had repaired a building in between 421 and 423. Many such repairs and restorations can be found in the later decades as well. An inscription dated from 473 AD, so shortly after Ricimer's sack of Rome, shows how the urban prefect of that time, Anicius Acilius Aginantius Faustus, had repaired the atrium of Minerva that had been damaged during Ricimer's sack in 472. It was a portico or vestibule in front of the Senate house, the famous Curia Julia. This portico housed a gilded statue of the goddess Minerva. The inscription not only records the restoration by the Praefectus Urbi, but also advertises a return to the, quote, happiness of the age, end quote, as the prefect has written it. In that time, the Emperor Olybrius resided in the palace on the Palatine Hill. But even after the last emperors resided in Rome, the repairs continued. In 484 AD, there was an earthquake which probably inflicted quite some damage onto the city, but repairs were carried out immediately under the new king Odoacer, and the senator Decius Marius Venantius Basilius quickly organized the repair of the Colosseum, which had been damaged in that earthquake. And please like this video and subscribe, and also turn on the bell so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And if you want to suggest video topics of your own, participate in polls, ask questions, chat with me or other enthusiasts of the Roman Empire, or participate in exclusive live streams, you can gain these perks by supporting our work on Patreon or via becoming a YouTube member. Thanks to your support, we will be able to explore many different topics of the late Roman Empire. Gratias agut tibi, amici. Then later in the Ostrogothic kingdom, Theodoric himself would reside from time to time in the palace of the Caesars on the Palatine Hill, and he allotted the revenue from the wine tax for repairs and restoration of this great monumental palace complex. He also reissued laws that would severely punish looters of buildings, a law that had already been issued by Maiorianus himself 40 years earlier. This shows that by that time, a practice had already started, where damaged buildings were being looted for building materials instead of being repaired. But there is other evidence that Rome was not as in bad a shape as is sometimes believed. For instance, Fulgentius, an African monk, exclaimed after visiting Rome in 500 AD, "How beautiful must the heavenly Jerusalem be when the earthly Rome shines in such splendor." This is hardly something somebody would say if Rome had been a field of ruins by that time. Then, 36 years later, the Eastern Roman historian Procopius of Caesarea was in Rome, and we can read in his work The Gothic Wars, De Bello Gotico, or Book 8 of his History of the Wars. The Romans love their city above all the men we know, and they are eager to protect all their ancestral treasures and to preserve them so that nothing of the ancient glory of Rome may be obliterated. So then, should this be taken as proof that Rome, even after 3 sacks and after the population had declined from 1 million to as little as 100 or 200,000 by 536 AD, that the city was still in pristine condition and that the glory of Rome shone as brightly as ever? Of course not, and this should be clear from the context. Of course, there was decay. Especially the outerlying parts of the huge city must have been gradually abandoned as the population shrank. When an earthquake damaged the city, the outerlying buildings or temples were not reconstructed, but their building material looted and used for new buildings, as mentioned before. When the buildings near the center of the city were repaired, we can be quite sure that this happened by reusing material from collapsed buildings in the outer lying regions. There is archaeological evidence not only of the repairs that we mentioned, but also of the decay. For example, at least one column of the temple of Mars Ultor must have collapsed by around 500 AD, quite possibly due to the earthquake of 484. One patrician called Decius immediately claimed the column for himself, as can be found in an engraving on that column dating from around that time. But the column itself was never reused and left lying directly at the temple of Mars Ultor. And it is again Procopius that describes how other parts of the city were in worse shape. For example, he describes how the roof of the Temple of Jupiter, which had been torn down by the Vandals in 455, had never been repaired, and that people were sometimes even driving cattle through some of the forums. There is also newer evidence that the Basilica Aemilia had sustained fire damage, possibly during the sack of Alaric in 410, but was only repaired on the outside to give a splendorous outward appearance, but on the inside it was left burnt out and not repaired. We can thus see that Rome had been kept in repair until the outbreak of the Gothic Wars in 536 AD, but of course it should be quite clear that Rome was not as glorious and splendorous anymore as it had been before the first sack of 410 AD. So how can we imagine Rome of that time? I think we can imagine it as islands of splendor intermixed with decay, where some parts, especially the inner core regions of the city, were kept in good shape with many repairs, so that at least towards the outside there was the appearance of continued glory. We can assume that, for example, the Forum Romanum must still have looked quite impressive around 500 AD, as confirmed by the exclamation of Fulgentius. But of course, on the inside, the picture was very different. Although splendorous on the outside, the Basilica Aemilia was quite possibly a burnt-out husk on the inside, and many statues and adornments were stolen in the three sacks, so that, for example, the baths of Caracalla or Diocletian certainly didn't look as impressive anymore as in their prime. Then there were certainly many collapsed buildings and spreading decay, especially in the more outwards lying regions of this huge city, because we should not forget that the city was really exceptionally large for its time. Actually, by surface area, still the largest city in the world. So we can thus say that Rome from 476 AD until the start of the Gothic Wars in 536 AD must have offered a very mixed picture. On the one hand, there were these islands of continued glory and impressiveness, especially at the Colosseum, at the Forum Romanum, and some other inner parts of the city, but intermixed with widespread urban decay, where especially the outer lying regions would fall more and more into disrepair. And from time to time, apparently, some collapsed columns were just left as they were, even in the more inwards lying regions, such as being the case at the temple of Mars Ultor. If you want a modern day analogy for how this could have looked, the American city of Detroit might present a comparison. In this city, especially the more outward lying regions have fallen into disrepair, while the inner core is being kept in shape, and many buildings are being restored and even new ones erected. But in Detroit, we also see islands of splendor intertwined with urban decay. Some buildings are surprisingly well preserved, but others have fallen into disuse. This is not too dissimilar to how Rome must have looked around 500 AD. Rome had such a mixed picture that even Procopius is very contradictory when describing Rome in his books, sometimes praising the care the Romans undertook in preserving the ancient glory, and then suddenly again describing a picture of utter decay. But it must have still been impressive in parts, else Fulgentius would not have compared the city to heavenly Jerusalem as late as 500 AD. But we know by now that the real disaster for the city would start with the Gothic Wars, and that already by 600 AD the picture must have been really desolate. I will examine the state of the city immediately after the Gothic Wars and by around 600 AD, of course in great detail in future videos. And if you are even more interested in the state of Rome in those times, these are my two most detailed videos on that topic, where I examine Rome in 476 AD and in 536 AD. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias amici imperii Romani, and bene vale.